Well, we are watching shares of Hertz closely this morning after news that its CEO will resign after a failed attempt into EVs. That stock up about 1% right now. This follows an announcement back in January where the car retail company said it would sell 1/3 of its fleet on low demand and increasing costs. All of this, of course, coming against the backdrop of EV adoption rates slowing, although there is still growth, and Western EV makers facing increasing competition from Chinese players. Let's bring in Greg Migliore, Autoblog Editor-in-Chief, to discuss more. Greg, good to talk to you today. You know, there's been so much news here within the EV space that seems to point to a bit of a doom and gloom. Adoption rates aren't as rapid as they were several years ago. We were just talking about Fisker the other day and how they are pausing production because of a cash crunch. What's the overall trend point to?
So right now, I think we're in a state of where it's like the late stage early adopters. So a lot of the folks who were really interested in EVs, they already have them. So now you're at that point where you're somewhere in that delta between, hey, when's the mainstream general public going to really get and understand and use EVs? And all the people who essentially were really the first ones to get it, they already have them. So that's a challenging spot to be. And of course, infrastructure remains a great challenge. Just the news you were talking about with Shell and of course with BP, that's going to help dramatically, because one of the biggest challenges EV owners and users face is it's a bit of a different experience simply to power up your car. You have to seek out the charger. You have to make sure the charger might be working. If it doesn't work, you have to go someplace else. All of that adds complexity to what is already a technology that is a little bit different for a lot of folks.
Greg, what we have learned over the course of the last 6 months even is that you got big players like a GM or a Ford that can afford to be able to pull different levers. GM getting into more hybrids as a result of what they're seeing in the market. And then you've got the upstarts like a Fisker, like a Rivian, like a Lucid, who don't have that kind of flexibility. So if we're talking about a bit of a lull until the next wave begins, where does that leave those upstarts?
So the upstarts historically have always been in kind of a dangerous position. I almost hate to say that, but you see that where they don't have as much of a room of a margin for error. Fisker is talking about partnering with Nissan. We've heard some news in the last couple of weeks that Fisker's finances perhaps aren't where they need to be. And upstarts always face those challenges. Rivian is a great example of revealing a couple of really interesting new products in the last couple of weeks, the R2 and the R3. They're going to be more affordable. They're amazing, looking as far as designs. Really, I think something that could give consumers something to think about. They also mentioned, hey, they're not going to build these at a factory in Georgia. They're going to consolidate their manufacturing operations in Illinois. That's good business sense, but it also is a situation where the company is being mindful that having multiple factories, having these large footprints might be a bit too ambitious. I'm pretty optimistic for a company like Rivian. As far as Fisker, Fisker has always been great as far as design. I remember there was a Fisker about 10, 15 years ago, and this is at least the second iteration of Fisker. They appear to have less staying power, but we'll see.
Greg, does this open up or at least increase the possibility of M&A? I mean, you've already talked about potential for Nissan and Fisker, some kind of partnership there. What about Rivian? What about Lucid?
Well, it's always a natural situation where you have these smaller companies like Lucid, like Rivian, like Fisker that have one or two compelling products, something that maybe a larger automaker, Volkswagen, General Motors, Honda, might want to get that product. So I think they're always vulnerable to, being picked off, but there's also, that's challenging in and of itself, because if you say somebody were to buy Fisker, you have to deal with all the challenges that then comes with managing a smaller company that perhaps isn't as well integrated into your culture as, some like an existing, just standing up an existing entity. So there's challenges in that sense as well. I think a lot of these companies are very good at developing interesting products, vehicles that are fun to drive. They look great. They have the range. They have the batteries. But then when it comes to mass production, selling them and reaching like a new market that will grow their company, that's where the challenge comes in. Lucid is a great example of a company that makes a very compelling product. They're well funded, of course, but they're also very expensive vehicles. So I kind of doubt a company like Lucid will ever be truly mainstream.
Greg, you know, the expectation is this second wave of adopters are going to be a lot more price conscious. You mentioned infrastructure a concern, but price still very much high. When you talk about these brands that you just mentioned, as they look to offer more affordable vehicles, you've got the Chinese players like a BYD selling cars that are, what, $10,000, maybe a little less in China. Even if you have the tariffs, you're still talking about a very aggressive price strategy. Does that leave a lot of these Western car makers particularly vulnerable when they don't have a low-cost offering right now?
That's always going to be tricky. I don't think there is sort of an immediate, danger, if you will, of the U.S. market being flooded with, products from overseas manufacturers, particularly from China. The U.S. market in particular has a high cost of entry, a high barrier of entry for automakers. It always has. Americans like their cars large. They like them well equipped. It's a highly regulated market. It's not an easy thing to do. I saw a BYD vehicle at the Detroit Auto Show in 2008, 2010, and they're still not here. So I think that's a little bit of it's a business, it's a product situation that in some ways has actually gotten to be political. I think where you're going to see U.S. and European automakers compete with China is in other overseas markets, perhaps in India, perhaps in China itself, in South America. And that's where it's going to be tricky to see how American automakers and other Western automakers could get that cost down to compete with, a $10,000 BYD car that has great range and looks interesting. That will be a big challenge for Western automakers.
Okay, we'll be watching that head-to-head play out. Greg Migliore, Autoblog Editor-in-Chief. Good to talk to you today. Appreciate the time.